Welcome. It's a beautiful spring afternoon in the historic area, and you're in the Carpenter's yard. Well, some of you have probably been here before. I'm Garland Wood, Master Carpenter. We've got something new to show you right now. The subject of today's program is dormer windows. You don't typically build a dormer down here on the ground. This is a little weird, but I'll tell you the method behind our madness here. Number one, we are interested in all things involving 18th century construction. And over the last 40 so years, we built a lot of workshops. We built barns and farm buildings and other kinds of structures, but we haven't built many with dormer windows. So frankly, we needed the practice. Number two, we discovered some things about early dormers that we wanted to try out for ourselves. For instance, we know that today when you build a dormer window, something that's breaking the plane of the roof, to keep the water out, you've got to put in metal flashing or other kinds of membranes to keep the water out. But in the period, they didn't do it. They didn't use metal flashing around dormers. Now you will see lead flashing around chimneys. You'll see it around, sometimes ornamental brickwork has a bit of lead flashing on it, but lead's really expensive. So they just skipped it for dormer windows. So we're trying to figure out, how do you just use carpentry to keep the water out of this big hole that you've made in the roof? The third reason we want to build a dormer is so that it's a wonderful project for an apprentice like Matt to do as part of his training. Our apprentices go through 5 levels of training to attain the rank of journeyman or the level of journeyman. And we didn't have a building with a dormer on it, so I asked Matt just to go ahead and build one from scratch. So it's a chance to kind of examine the old stuff, to look at the old fabric, to look at a dormer in the house really just down Nicholson Street from us, to use the traditional methods to kind of rediscover or reverse engineer how this process was done, and then pass it on to somebody who's going to find this useful in his career later on at Williamsburg. So that's the method behind our madness. Now we want to do a deep dive into dormers. Oh, and by the way, dormer, it's from a French word that means to sleep. So this is something that you're putting up in the attic of a home to turn those attic spaces into bed chambers. Think dormitory, same kind of idea. If you've got questions during the program, feel free to send them in, and we'll try to get to your questions in the second half of what we're doing. So look forward to hearing from your questions, and I need to let Matt tell you a little bit more about how to build a dormer.
Sure. Well, welcome. I'm Matt Sandbury. I'm one of the apprentices here on the carpentry crew. So as Garland kind of mentioned, this is a part of a building. So when we talk about putting something like this architectural feature in one of these buildings, we're going to address it much like we do any other part of the building. So the very first component that we have with the process of making a dormer is the case, the window case itself. This is essentially a part of a wall, if you will, projecting out of that roof line. So in this particular instance here, we have a very common size window case. This is so that we can actually reuse this in a building that we are going to reconstruct later in future. So this piece and component could still get reused. But this is the main portion. Behind this, in some of the pictures that we've taken and still shots of it already, you can see some of the other components. There's things like studs, which are elements that are used to attach the siding to. Above that, we have essentially a plate, which is the top of a wall segment. It's also where the rafters meet. So that is a very small element in a dormer because it's a very small section of that architecture. We do, in fact, also have those rafters, which make up a very small roof over that projection sticking out of the roof. So in this particular instance, it's essentially like a very small building sticking out of the existing principal roof of your big building. And that's really the goal here, is to make a wall-mounted window inside of that particular dormer. So the wall-mounted window projecting past the roof, you now have to protect that hole that Garland was talking about with a roof of its own. And when we're talking about roofs, we really can't go on without mentioning shingles, which of course are what make up a waterproof surface on the top section of your house. And Garland?
Yeah, let's talk shingles. So we get a lot of questions about this when people come through the yard. What in the world, how do you take little pieces of wood like this and keep a thunderstorm from soaking the inside of your house? There are kind of 3 secrets to making a shingle roof work. I think this is important to get this figured out, because then we're going to break some of these rules when we build a dormer, and we're going to come back to these rules with how to figure out to make that dormer watertight. So number one rule, you only see 1/3 of a shingle when it's on a roof. So they're about 18 inches long, 6 inches to the weather. So you can see we've nailed a course across the bottom. We come up 6 inches. Now the second rule is look how we've staggered the shingles. So it's really important that the shingle above cover the gap between the shingles below. If these gaps line up, you're guaranteed to have a leak. And the third secret to a shingle roof, so remember we've covered the gaps. Our roof is 3 shingles thick, but we're also real steep. A nice steep pitch. The steeper the roof, the faster the water runs off. So pitch is important in any kind of roof, modern or 18th century. And generally speaking, steeper roofs make for better performing shingles. It also means there's more room upstairs, which means you can turn them into living quarters, which means you make dormers. So if that's kind of logical, you don't see dormers on flat pitch roofs. It won't work. So that's the secret to shingles. By the way, there's 1 nail holding every shingle on this building. So we're going to have to go visit our friends at the blacksmith shop first before it's time to start installing a roof. Matt's going to tell us a little bit about this critical connection between the side of the dormer and the main roof itself.
Yeah. So when we're looking at the shingles, they're of course going to work when we're looking at a principal roof. So a normal building is going to have, of course, the 2 roof pieces coming together, and that's great. That's always going to work as long as you follow the same rules that Garland was just talking about, the seams and the consistency and how much exposure of the weather there is on that shingle. So those are some of the more basic rules that we follow, which will always work until you stick a big hole in it. So how we now create a seam like this. So when we're talking about making a wall projecting up out of that roof line, you've automatically made a very fragile place within that roof. So that's part of what this experiment, this dormer's building process was for us, was to really figure out a new way of doing this. So we are very comfortable with the method that we've applied on this side. So backing up here, this dormer, if we cut it in half, we're using 2 different methods to actually create the seams. This side over here, though they look the same, are very different. This side here, you can see just a little bit, right? These shingles, though they look like they're flat, in fact, they're riding up a ramp. So under these shingles, closer to the dormer, is a series of boards that are thicker on the outside, and they taper down. So these shingles are actually rising up the ramp. So gaining elevation by about 1 inch. So all the water coming down the siding, once it touches the shingles, it's not interested in running alongside of the dormer. It's actually going to run away from it. So this is a method that we see pretty commonly here in Williamsburg. It's been used hundreds of times in the recreations and reconstructions of the buildings here. But it's something that we know and are pretty comfortable with. But about 2 years ago, some of the research found some newer methods. So looking at this side here, we can now look at how there's a little difference, right? You can see that the siding actually goes past the shingles. Normally that's not a great feature. That's not something you want. That means water can get below your roof. But in this particular instance, which is based on 2 examples that are local here, one just down the road, the Booker tenement, is one of our original buildings. This feature is found there, as well as another building called Farmer's Mount, which is very early. So we can see these features here. Right? So both of these are accurate representations of Williamsburg buildings, but how this one works is a little different. Underneath the shingles here is a gutter. So all of the water coming down the siding, it can get between the siding and the roof. It gathers in the gutter that is under the siding, and it empties out right here. Right? So the water still has a pathway around the dormer without any sort of issue. If we were to go inside and look at the familiar method, you're going to see those features here. So a stack of the shingles are present, which means, of course, that the siding terminates on those shingles, giving you somewhat of an easier time to install it, but in other times it's actually giving you some complexities when we're talking about lapping all of these methods together, from the siding to the roof up to the dormer's roof, which we call the woven shingles there. So all of these features are a little bit more tricky when we look at the big picture. This side over here, when we're looking at the newer method, I say newer, but it's actually older, is utilizing that gutter. And you may be able to see some of that right here, where the siding actually persists all the way down through, and you don't see any of that roof, telling you that this is more of an angular method. It's applying a really good seam with that gutter there. But now, when we look at any one of these systems, either of these systems, they're both going to work in their only small element. Now, when we look at the large portion of this whole dormer, it's only going to work if what's above it is still holding water. Right? So when we look back at the shingles that are branching up here, your principal roof is only going to remain until we get to this course up here. Right? So once you get up to where the roof actually runs around, we're talking about a swept valley, and Garland is going to talk a little bit about the swept valley and something called a comb.
Happy to. So we've got 3 places this dormer really could leak. Matt's talked about how the water's trapped in the gutter here that's coming down the siding. You've also got the very peak of the thing. Remember that our shingles are triple lapped and they're 18 inches long. So when you put up your 18-inch course, one course of shingles actually covers the end of the second. So we just have one little lap, but that's a good start. Because remember, we had 2 more courses. We got a 12-inch course that's going to go up there, and it's going to overlap in the other direction. And then we finally have a 6-inch course, which will overlap in the first direction. In other words, we're triple lapped, and we've left one course of boards 2 inches proud to the weather. We call that a comb course. Just like on a chicken. And all the houses here in town, when you're in Williamsburg, walk around and look at the peak of the roof, you can see this little bit of comb sticking out against the weather. So no matter how hard the wind and the rain are blowing, it's very hard for water to force its way through this joint. As a matter of fact, we're very happy to announce this is a very, very dry, successful roof system. Again, no flashing. We're just using the carpentry to keep the water out. And then there's finally the valley, and that's where the 2 planes, the main roof and the dormer roof, which, by the way, are the same pitch, it's where they meet. If 2 planes meet, you've got to have a 45. You've got to have a valley, and that means that your joints are all going to line up, and you're going to have leakage, and you probably have to put metal flashing under that to make it work. What we're going to do instead is we're going to sculpt the shingles so that they're narrow at the bottom and wide at the top. Think about the sections of a fan. And using that system, this swept valley, we can actually turn the corner and keep a consistent triple lap and keep coverage of the upper shingles over the gaps below. These are pretty rare. There are not many swept valleys to be seen in Williamsburg, so this was a lot of fun to figure this out. We actually found an original one. We've seen pictures of an original one from an early Virginia house. Now, how in the world do you have an original 18th century roof? Shingles last 50, 60, sometimes 100 years. Well, they won't last 300 years. The house we found this on had dormer windows on both sides, and then an addition was built on the back, which captured all of this roof system up in the attic of that addition. sealing it up like a King Tut's tomb. And we were able to get up there and see the original swept valleys. That's the kind of discovery that makes this all pretty darn interesting. I mentioned we have 3 sources of leak. I'm really not correct. There is a 4th source of a leak. There's a big hole right here. As a carpenter, I can't really do too much about that. But let me introduce Peter Hudson, who's going to talk to you about how a joiner is going to solve our problem.
All right. So my name is Peter Hudson. I'm one of the apprentice joiners, and a big part of our apprenticeship is making windows. A joiner's job is to do all the finish work. So where your carpenters are focused on the big picture, getting the frame of the building done, my job is to get along there and it's to kind of do all the detail work. So windows, doors, the fancy moldings and cornices, that's my kind of work. But this, I'm coming up towards the end of my apprenticeship, and one of the things that all the apprentices over at the joinery have to do is we have to build some windows. And this has been a fantastic opportunity for me to do that for myself. Now, a window has a lot of complicated joinery going into it, and at the end of the day, the window has to be flawlessly square. If the sides are not parallel, it's not going to be able to go up and down inside of the frame. And if it's not the right thickness, it's not going to be able to slide past its buddy on the inside of this thing. And worse, if it's not square, the glass will not fit in there either. So the level of just precision that's required on a window is higher than anything else we do at the joinery. However, if you can make a window successfully without crying the entire time, you're probably going to be okay. So I was very excited for this opportunity, and I would like to say I think I only cried for about 75% of the process. So yeah, we're pretty happy with that. This is my upper sash right here. So you've got 2 sashes. Upper sash tends to be locked in place. Material for both of these is longleaf southern yellow pine. It's a very slow-growing material. It's an exceptionally strong material. We love working with it over at the joinery. So this is actually what you're looking at right here is the inside of the window. The section you guys are generally going to be looking at is going to be this section right here. This is the outside. You'll notice, rather than the decorative moldings that I have right here, we've got these rabbets. These are just little 90-degree cuts that are made into the wood, and that's where the pane of glass is going to be installed. So I'm going to fill this hole with these pieces and then fill these tinier holes with panes of glass so you can get some light into the upstairs of the building. So I'm going to practice a little bit of cat burglary here and let myself into the second story of a house. All right. And I'm going to take my sash with me and give you an idea of what this all should look like when it's done. All right. So the upper sash goes in and it sits. Can you see me okay now? There you go. All right. So it sits on a couple of little pieces right here. And then the lower sash, this guy, is going to sit in a groove just behind that. And there you go. If I want to open the window, I just slide that thing up and slide it back down. We've got a nice finished window in this thing now. Sans the panes of glass, I'm working on that end. But yeah, that's what I've got as far as the actual sash for the window goes.
It's time to put it to the test.
Yeah.
So no good experiment can go without some testing. And of course, the best way to test a dormer roof is to rain. So I thought I saw a cloud coming, but I think we're just going to have to provide our own rain here for a minute. This dormer's been up for several months now, and when the water collects up on the roof of the shop, it really does dump on the building a lot like this. By the way, a shameless plug from our friends in the tinsmith shop who made this fine watering can for us. Matt, can you run it kind of back this way a little bit so you can see the swept valley working and how it's channeling the water down? The water's being directed away from the dormer by the slope of those shingles, and the little bit of water that's coming in should be starting to come out. Oh, you can see it right there, coming out of the gutter down below. So you are looking at the only brand new 18th century dormer in our country today, having a successful test. Now we're looking forward to many more tests. We're going to involve some of the other apprentices in lathing and plastering the inside of this thing and perhaps even making paint to go on top of it. So we've had a lot of fun with this project. I'm sure that you have a lot of questions, so I'm going to turn that over to our host.
Well, thank you so much, Garland, Matt, and Peter. You mentioned, finishing up the inside. So we talked a lot about the outside, but can you tell us a little bit more about what's going to go on the inside? Who's going to do that work? Traditionally, who would do that work? Who's going to do it today, and so forth?
Sure. So in any building project, today in the 21st century or in the 18th century, you're going to see multiple trades involved. So today we might see a mason or a plumber, electricians, carpenters, trim carpenters. You're going to see plumbers, all sorts of different people involved. Nothing really has changed in that sense from the time period we're talking about. So the bricklayers are, of course, the people doing the foundations and the chimney work. The carpenters are raising the frame. Joiners are finishing the frame out and filling the holes, making it look pretty. You're going to have plasterers, painters. You're going to have a lot of different people involved in building a building in the 18th century. In our dormer here, beyond Peter and myself, it has gone past us, as Garland just mentioned, to our masonry trades as well, where we had Nick, one of the apprentices in that particular shop. He was trying to work through some of the more difficult parts of making the plaster lath fit for something like a dormer window. And of course, you're talking about a wall, a ceiling, and another ceiling all meeting each other. So which seam goes over which portions? That's sort of a tricky thing to figure out. And a dormer like this is really a great way to experiment with that without really getting involved with a real building.
So we've been talking about a dormer as new construction. Susie was curious, would it or could it be done in the 18th century that a dormer would be added to an existing building in the 18th century?
I'd be happy to answer that one. In fact, we see a lot of houses have their dormers added. The Booker tenement, which is a building that we based this reconstruction on, it had dormers added. And what was really interesting is you could get up in the attic and see where old rafters had been cut and slid over to make room. Now, we like to frame our houses on 2-foot centers. So, every one of us carries a 2-foot rule in our pocket. So that's typically how wide apart the rafters are up in a roof. That's a pretty skinny dormer. So if you want to add a dormer, one of those rafters has to be cut and slid over and then the roof redone. So we've actually seen that quite a bit. Other houses, of course, Governor's Palace was built with the dormers on it from the very beginning. But you can certainly add them.
So Dana was curious, Peter, about how long on average it might take to make a 6-light sash.
All right, so 6 lights is going to be a little bit more complicated than just the 4 lights I've got right here. But yeah, 6-light sash, we've got a 12-light sash in the shop, and we estimate about 18 hours for that between a journeyman and an apprentice. So 6-light sash, I'd hope 12 hours for something like that. I'll say, my first sash took me a lot of time to do. The second one, I was cranking through that process because it was a lot more comfortable. And I can definitely imagine getting faster and faster at that the more you do it. So I think 12 hours is perfectly within reach for something like that.
And you've got some tricks for streamlining sash production, right?
Absolutely, yeah. We'll try and get as much material out of one piece as possible. That way we don't have to make all the tiny cuts. These pieces right here are separate and they're tiny. So we tend to plane that up all as one single piece and then cut it after the fact before installing it in there. So yeah, there are lots of little ways to do that.
Oh.
But, yeah.
We've talked a lot about apprenticeship, and in particular today. We need to cross this project off the list to advance, and then that project, and so forth. But Tina is curious if you could tell us a little bit about apprenticeship more broadly. Was it project-based like this in the 18th century, or how does one advance through an apprenticeship then? How is that gauged?
Sure. An apprenticeship is really a contract. So it's by duration of somebody's age more than like a degree or something like that today, where you have to account for a certain number of things to have happened. An apprenticeship at the time, you're expected to learn, but how most apprenticeships were undertook at this time is by repetition. So giving an apprentice a task that is common enough that they're going to get the experience through doing it multiple times, not even dozens necessarily, but maybe even hundreds. So, for example, in carpentry, a great way to learn carpentry is to lay out and cut an entire wall. You're talking about the same joint being repeated throughout the entire process. The master may guide your hand through the very first one, and by maybe the 20th one, you're doing that on your own. So the best way I can compare it in modern life is really like math homework. The teacher will walk you through a series of easier steps, but it's really up to you to do the homework by following the same process that you learned in class. But that's really the best way that I can use in a modern day life that I think we all had to deal with.
Right. Well, Doug is curious about windows. You're showing windows here that don't have weights and pulleys and all this. So how well do they work? How long do they work for? And then also, Doug in particular wanted to know, how do they stay up or stay down without any of that extra stuff?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something that I haven't really gotten to yet. But there are, with this piece, on the inside of the window frame here, rather than having sash weights that will hold up the lower sash when it's pulled up, we actually have these nifty little pieces that we can roll in. They're just little cutouts. They're little bird mouths that'll hold it up in place when it's fully open. So yeah, you slide it all the way up, you flip these out, and they just hold it right in place like that. So yeah, you don't really have the choice that way of how far up the window is. So if you just want a light breeze through, you don't have that option with those. But yeah, that's how we'll do this particular window right here. But weights are absolutely something we can do. I have not done them yet. I'm looking forward to getting into them at some point, maybe a little bit further down the line with my apprenticeship. But yeah, and as far as windows lasting a long time, Garland, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, we have some original window frames and window sashes here in town.
We
still
sure
in
do.
Buildings, so.
We sure do, yep. So
Yeah.
just like anything, if you keep them in repair, keep them painted, they should last just fine.
Yeah.
So keep the neighborhood kid from throwing a rock through it. Well, we can still fix that, right? So we even have a lot of original panes of glass in our houses in Williamsburg. I'm pretty sure we have an exact count of the number of original panes of glass we have.
So you certainly mentioned weights. Maybe we can reiterate this a little bit. Kay was curious, did they have sash weights in the 18th century? When do we first see those? Do those go back a long, long ways before our time, or?
I think the conventional wisdom is they're starting to be popular at the end of the 17th century. So, Williamsburg was created in 1699, and one of the first buildings to be built in Williamsburg was our Capitol, and it mentioned in the act for building the Capitol it was to have sashes. So before sashes, you've got casement windows. They don't need weights. They just swing open like a door. As you get into large, elaborate sash windows, the new fashion of 1700 for America, some of those start to be pretty darn heavy. And so these are not just weights, but they're really counterweights to make it easy to move that heavy sash up and down. So they're here from the very early period of Williamsburg. We do find casement windows too. In fact, I know we found them at the coffee house site when we did that work. And so we recreated some casement windows down in the basement. But we also had an original coffee house window sash that survived with the rope nailed to the side that used to be attached to the weights. So that was pretty neat. That was clear evidence that you had both casements and weighted sash. The coffee house is a 1750s, 1760s building.
So Amanda is curious about the shingles. You mentioned, all those nails, one nail for each shingle. Are those shingles pre-bored before, or do you drive the nail? And if you do drill a hole first, do you do that down on the ground, or you do that up on the roof?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when you're installing the shingles, you really don't know exactly the placement of that nail until you're going to install it. So it's not great to go about drilling a hole in a place where it may or may not actually line up. So oftentimes you just do that up on the roof. And it seems like a small awl or a gimlet is really what you're going to use to do that. It's a very small drill that's just simply pushed in contact with the shingle and then spun around to actually drill that hole. If you're to just use a square nail and drive it through these cedar shingles, so Atlantic white cedar, they can split, because of course we are nailing in that very thin top 6 inches of the shingle itself. So instead of even just risking that, it's best just to put a little hole there where you want it and then drive your nail in.
So you mentioned Atlantic white cedar. Is that the main shingle material, or what are some of the other options? And where would those materials be coming from? Is that a locally sourced wood?
I'd be happy to. Cypress seems to have been their favorite. Cypress grows all through the Chesapeake. They liked white cedar as well because it was so light. But I think cypress, well, we know cypress would last 100 years on roofs in the 18th century. They were using the old growth trees from the swamp. So where's it coming from? There's a shingle industry in the 18th century that involved enslaved shingle getters. That was the term. And these shingle makers, the shingle getters, were living in places like the Dismal Swamp for most of every year. In other words, 10 months out of every year, they're living in the swamp right where the trees are, felling the cypresses, splitting them, knifing them. 1773, Virginia exports 10 million shingles out of the colony. So shingles were big business. And I think, so these cypress trees aren't here in Williamsburg, and people in Williamsburg aren't making shingles. They're buying shingles that are coming from swamps and marshlands. And shingle making in early Virginia is almost entirely African American work. Well, 100 years for a roof is pretty amazing. They also use heart pine. And if you get out of the tidewater, then you might have to go with oak for a roof shingle, or chestnut, or walnut. I mean, there's lots of different woods. You've got to find a tree that'll split straight and something that's fairly durable outside. But we're blessed down here in the tidewater with these durable softwoods like cypress and cedar.
What about the glass? Where was the glass coming from, and would it already be sized, or is that something the joiner's doing, or were there glaziers?
Yeah, that's a great question. Glass, obviously today you can visit Jamestown, you can see them blowing glass over there. That doesn't really last, especially up to our period. By this point, we're just importing glass. It's being made back in Europe and it's shipped to us. Kind of the trick with glass is that you can ship it in large pieces, but it'll arrive in smaller pieces. So generally we get them sized and we order them a particular size. And frankly, I don't have the tools, or I don't know, I have access to the tools, but it is a very difficult process of cutting glass, and you tend to break a bit of it when you're learning how, and glass is really expensive. We're talking one pane of glass for like one of the sashes right here is gonna be about 1/3 of my daily income. So I don't wanna break that, because that's probably coming out of my paycheck. So we tend to order the panes of glass the exact size we want. We get them shipped here. And then we'll build the actual sash around whatever size panes we get, because measurement is standardized, but it's not always locked in flawlessly. So their 8x10 at the glass cutter might be my 9 7/8 by 8 1/16. So yeah. So we're ordering glass from across the ocean, and we're not really cutting it. We're just glazing it here on the ground. Yeah.
Something too that's easy to forget is glass gets very political. It becomes one of the things that Americans start to refuse to import based on political differences with the mother country. So the non-importation agreements, which kind of affects people like you and me, right? Can't get window glass for your jobs because of the politics of the day.
Matthew was curious about, going back to shingles, was there any coating applied to the shingles after the building was done, like pine tar or something, to help protect them and help them last
you want
longer?
to handle Matthew's question?
Sure. Sure, Matthew. Yeah, so you do see in some cases a covering for the shingles. A coat of pine tar is fine. And the other cases that we see, fish oil or linseed oil, and both of those can be making up a paint as well. So there's absolutely nothing saying, if you have the expense to cover your roof with a fish oil, that you don't throw a little pigment in there and just paint your roof. We know that happened. It was definitely not on par with leaving your roof natural. And as Garland covered before, most of these shingles would outlast you. So if 80 to 100 years on a brand new cypress roof is expected, then there really isn't any advantage to help preserve the roof, but there is something to get if you're trying to make your house look prettier by painting it. So pine tar is a great alternative if we're talking about a cheap roof. So if we're walking away from shingles altogether, if you're in a rural context and you're not talking about having the expense of cedar, cypress, or heart pine shingles, and you're talking about an oak board mounted up there that's a split board, a very cheap alternative, yeah, you might want to put some pine tar on there. That'll take your 10-year life of a clapboard and maybe double it. So maybe you'll get 20 years out of that roof instead of the 10. So in that case, yeah, that's viable. But I don't think in town here in Williamsburg it was a necessary thing to cover your roof with really anything.
We're probably missing something too, which is the flammability of these wood roofs. And of course, tar and fish oil and linseed oil don't help with that. So every early American city and town has got horror stories of house fires spreading and burning entire blocks down. And Williamsburg had lots of those incidents as well. And we just have to confess right now as builders, it is kind of a sad thing when a house burns down. But we are in the building business, so we're here to help.
So to that end, what both you, Garland, and Matt have said brings us a question from Susie, wondering if anyone ever used slate roof, did slate roof or other materials, getting away from wood in Williamsburg in the 18th century.
Sure. Yeah, so beyond wood, we know that there are two very common alternatives that were used here in Williamsburg. Slate you can see in the case of the Governor's Palace. But he was really the only person that could afford slate. So that's one of the things that we see in history. We know slate was being used at this time period, but just not regularly here. In places where slate is a little more common, it certainly has a more viable surrounding use. The other one that we see in town here is clay tiles. So clay tiles can be a perfectly fine thing here. In particular, on this peninsula, what do we have a lot of is clay and wood. So those are really the things that I think you're going to find the expenditure of money being a little bit easier to get yourself a handful of clay tiles or wooden shingles. But we don't see a lot of things like thatching. We don't see much in any other forms of roofing that the English we know were using, but just not here in this area. I hope that answers that.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we have time for one more question to maybe talk about the future of both the dormer. You've made a strange thing here, a dormer on the ground. So what's the destination ultimately for this? Or is it something that's going to be kept together? Maybe you don't know. And then the other thing is for Peter and Matt in particular, what's next in the apprenticeship? Give people a taste of that experience.
Sure. Well, Garland, why don't you answer the first part, and then Peter and I'll...
So what the destination of this dormer is?
Yeah.
Well, keep in mind the purpose of building the dormer was education, so that we could help to understand an 18th century process that had been lost, and help some apprentices develop their skills. And hopefully what we're doing right now is also, I would file into the education area. We're trying to kind of put forward this knowledge out to the world. But we just can't leave this dormer window here. So at some point we'll take it apart, and we can reuse these shingles on our next building. And I think all these other components will live on in another one of our structures. Yeah. But frankly, I'm kind of attached to it. I'm not in a real hurry to take it down because it's such fun to talk about. It's also a little bit easier to access than 25 feet up in the air, so people can really get a chance to see it. But if I were a betting man, I'd say in a year's time that this was no longer here. It's just been turned back into parts for other buildings.
Peter?
Yeah, as far as our apprenticeship goes, we run, we've got the 5 levels of the apprenticeship, and we're shooting generally to finish that in about 6 years. So I'm in my 6th year of apprenticing, and because of a lot of complications, including a global pandemic, we're not going to finish on time. You know, when we finish up our apprenticeships, we become journeymen here. We get a little bit more latitude in what we get to take on. We get to expand our trade and add in features that might not have been there when we learned it. And of course, one of my favorite things is we get to train apprentices of our own. So we get to make someone else go through what we had to and kind of make them suffer as well, but also spread this knowledge, share it, and as you know, Garland alluded to, make sure it's not lost again, because we're constantly rediscovering how things are done. And so that's kind of the stuff I'm looking forward to once I become a journeyman. Matt?
Yeah. So I, like Peter, am fairly close to the end of my apprenticeship. There's only a few more things that really have to be checked off the list for me. We normally complete our apprenticeship by building an entire building, calling the entire process of it. So essentially leading the rest of the crew. In our case here, there are 6 of us on this crew. So that'd be coordinating and working with the 5 others on the crew to actually push through an entire job. I certainly have to do that one. And there are a few small things here and there that still need to get pushed on my apprenticeship. I think both Peter and I are happily waiting for the end.
It's never going to come if you just sit and wait, you know.
Easy
Anyway,
words for
thank
Kevin.
you, Matt and Peter and
course.
Garland, for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us, and your skills with us today. Thanks, everybody, for watching along, for your questions and encouraging comments. This program, of course, was made possible by the generosity of our donors, for which we are grateful. To learn how you can support presentations like this, follow the link pinned to the comments below or visit us at colonialwilliamsburg.org. Gentlemen, you have any final thoughts to send us on our way?
Well, when everything's settled down a little bit, please come and see us. You know, we're always happy to see you here digitally, but we also like to see you here in our yard. So when things get better, come on over.
I'd like to just plug my shop, and we've got a restoration project coming down the line where we're working on a Saunders house, restoring an original building on the opposite end of town, and just look for more about that coming down the line over the next few months. But that's all I got to add.
We are always building stuff at Colonial Williamsburg, so we hope to see you real soon. Come on by the yard, and we'll tell you about what's going on. And thanks for tuning in today. Do you still tune in these days? Well, thank you. Good talking to everybody.